Hello guys to Syriana Analysis, this is Kevork Almasian. I watched a very cringy video on Twitter and it is about Syria. The spokesperson for the UN, Farhan Haq, he was asked by a Chinese journalist about the US occupation forces in Syria, and the journalist asked him if he thinks that the US presence in Syria is illegal and if it's considered occupation. And he says this is not a topic that we're dealing with it now. We are talking about Ukraine. And the Chinese journalist interrupts him and asks him, why can't we make a comparison? Do you think the US forces in Syria are occupation forces, similarly to as the UN considers Russian forces occupation army in Ukraine, right? And he says, apparently, according to him, that there are no US armed forces in Syria. This is what he says. And then he says he doesn't want to make comparisons and that what the Chinese journalist is speaking about is just analysis. And then the Chinese journalist tells him, then if there are no US occupation forces or any military personnel in Syria, then how do you explain, I'm paraphrasing him, the injuries among the US military personnel in Syria a few days ago by drone attacks against them? And he just gives the most embarrassing face expressions you can ever see on an international or a UN official. And I'm really like he doesn't answer that question, and I was really irritated, but also surprised because I expect everything, I mean, from an American official to deny their role in Syria, but from a UN official? Why do you lie? I don't understand. Why do you lie, Mr. Farhan? Why do you lie? I mean, the Americans themselves, they say they have at least 900 forces and personnel, military personnel in Syria. Donald Trump, when he was the president, he said, we are in Syria to steal the oil, and they're financing through selling the Syrian oil to in the black market, their presence in Syria and the militias that they arm and support in Syria. We have two different now armed militias that the Americans support. One of them is the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. They have around 60,000 fighters. So those are proxies for the United States, and also you have the so-called Marawir Saura, or they're also part of the so-called Free Syrian Army, and they are stationed in Al Tanaf border crossing. So truly, it bothers me because Americans do not deny that they are in Syria. Donald Trump says that they are stealing the oil. The advisor for the deputy defense minister of the United States, she says that they are in Syria, these forces are in Syria, first to control or take over the oil and also the wheat in Syria in order to use it as a bargaining chip or a pressure card against the Assad regime. So they want to they weaponize the wheat and the oil and the energy and the food basket of the Syrians in this dirty proxy war on Syria. So the Americans themselves, they confess. So I truly do not understand what was the logic behind that Farhan Haq, he denied this or falsified this report or tried to lie with a straight face. And this is something very serious because it comes from a UN official and he's the spokesperson of the UN. And the Syrian side has sent hundreds of reports to the UN General Secretary, to the UN General Assembly, to the UN Security Council, detailing the American activities in Syria and how they occupy the oil fields and how they burn the wheat and how they weaponize the fuel and the food of the Syrians against 20 million Syrians, basically. So here, why I'm bothered, because the UN is supposed to be neutral and supposed to give a very neutral position on different conflicts around the world and try to solve them. This is the main goal of the UN when it was established, for the different countries to have a forum, a collective forum where they gather and they solve the problems around the world. And apparently, some of the officials at the UN, they are, I don't know, like embedded with the American narrative. Not even that, because even the Americans, as I mentioned, do not deny and say that we are not here. So if there was an honest UN official he would definitely say that the American occupation of Syria didn't start in 2017 when there were like just American forces in Syria. He would say that the occupation of Syria started in 2011 because the US learned from its previous wars in Libya and in Iraq, and they don't want to send, boots underground, and that's why they train and armed multinational jihadists in Syria, Syrians, non-Syrians from all around the world, and they use these proxy forces against the Syrian government in order to topple this government. So, even according to the UN Charter, you cannot forcibly overthrow a government and install another one by foreign mediation or foreign meddling. And what happened in Syria is an attempt of coup d'etat. It's not a revolution. It's an insurrection. It's an insurgency, and the armed groups started from day one to fight against the Syrian government. And I have documented that extensively on Syriana analysis. So. In previous videos, I used to say like we are living in a jungle. Yeah, we're still living in a jungle, but it seems that it's worse than that. The people who are supposed to be on the neutral side or try to mediate between different countries in order to bring or reestablish peace and stability in Syria are actually not only defending the US forces, but they are even denying the existence of US forces in Syria. And this is really bothering me because it could lead to the complete destruction of the UN. And let's remember that such statements will be translated into actions. It will be translated into reports, UN reports against Syria. We had the OPCW falsifying the findings of their own researchers and own experts who were on the ground in Duma. They falsified the reports, and now the UN spokesperson says that there are no US occupation forces in Syria. So it seems that while we are moving to a multipolar world, it could also mean that the UN will either collapse completely, or there need to be a drastic reform in the UN, and maybe also to change the location of the UN from the United States to elsewhere, to more neutral country, because apparently a lot of UN officials are becoming under heavy influence of the Americans, or they are simply so ignorant. And even if they are ignorant, I ask myself, how can someone become the spokesperson for the UN if he or she is that ignorant? So I shared this video on my Twitter account. I will share it with you now, and I posted it on Facebook, and people were very, very outraged in Syria, and some Syrian diplomats even left comments telling me this is so shameful because we sent hundreds of reports to the UN detailing the US occupation of one-third of Syria and the sanctions and occupying the food basket and the energy resources, etc., etc. So I'm really out of words. I don't know what else to say about this. Of course, the situations in Syria and Ukraine aren't similar, but at the same time, they are somehow similar when it comes to the presence of foreign forces. Any foreign force that is located in Syria and isn't invited by the Syrian government, that is represented at the UN, whether you like the Syrian government or not, this is a different question. You accept the legitimacy of the Syrian government or not, it is a different issue. The Syrian government is represented in the UN, and it's the legitimate representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. And the government has invited the Russian forces, Iranian advisors, and at some point Hezbollah fighters to fight against the terrorist groups in Syria. Now, the Americans are still in Syria, they're uninvited, so they are occupation forces because they are in control of one-third of Syria, rich of wheat and fuel, against the will of the Syrian government and against the will of the Syrian people. Have the Americans asked the Syrians if they want to be in Syria? Okay, let's make a referendum and ask 24 million or 24 to 30 million people if they want American forces in Syria or not. And then we will see clearly that they are not welcomed. And it seems that the attacks against the American forces will increase. And in the next stage, as long as the Saudis, it seems, and the Iranians are getting along, and the Saudis and the Syrians will get along, it seems that Syria feels that they are several regional powers are becoming more like closer to Damascus, and this emboldens the position of the Syrian government in order to kick out the occupation forces, to restart the reconstruction. And this will also definitely mean that the Saudis, Emiratis, Iranians, Russians, and other powers who are now reconciling with Syria will have investment opportunities in Syria. And it seems that the Saudis want to invest in stability. For now, we don't know what's going to happen next. And the Chinese want to invest in stability, and the Russians want to invest in stability in the Middle East, because for them, this is in their own business interests. And they want to establish an environment in the region that fits or serves their business and economic interests. And there is nothing wrong in that, as long as they are honest about it. And the Syrian side is very interested in kicking out the American forces. And as I mentioned in previous videos, the attack that happened against the U.S. occupation forces, the drone attacks that the U.S. says that they were linked to, they are Iranian-linked groups or Iranian militias. No. When the U.S. forces responded to the sources of the fire that came of the drone, 5 Syrian military personnel died, and not Iranian-linked or Iranian militias died in Syria. So this is utter BS. And it's meant because if the Syrians resist against the American occupation forces, it's legal under international law. And that's why the American side, the Pentagon, they keep saying, oh, it's Iranian linked or Iranian militias, because Iranians do not have the right to resist American forces in Syria. But the truth is, this is a Syrian resistance against the American forces. And I consider the day when the Americans and the Turks withdraw from Syria, we should celebrate another Independence Day, just like when the Syrians celebrate the independence from the French occupation. So I've been your host, Kirk Almassian of Syriana Analysis. I just wanted to make this quick video for you. Now you will watch this 1.5 minute video of this UN official, Farhan Haq. Farhan in Arabic means happy. And it seems Farhan wasn't happy at all with the questions posed by the Chinese journalist, because he didn't expect a real journalist to somehow ask him serious questions. He didn't expect that, because usually most of the journalists just ask cliche questions. So next time.
Okay. Yes, Deji.
Couple of questions on Syria. Yesterday, there's a drone attack to a U.S. base in northeast Syria, which resulted in one death and 6 injured. After that, U.S. launched a airstrike, also killed 11 people in Syria. Any reaction from the Secretary General on this incident?
Oh, well, of course, we continue to be worried about all of the continuing tensions, and we are trying to see what can be done to lower the tensions from different forces in Syria, and we'll continue with those efforts.
Do you not to urge everybody to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria?
Well, of course, that's a given, and obviously it's important that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria is respected. At the same time, you're aware of the complexity of the situation of foreign forces, but we call for them to exercise restraint.
But do you think the presence of the U.S. military in Syria is illegal or not?
That's not an issue that we're dealing with at this stage. There's been a war.
But is that because it sounds very familiar. This week we talk a lot about the UN Charter, the international law, and relative resolutions. But it sounds to me a foreign presence, foreign military based presence in another country without invitation sounds like something else to me. You know.
I'll leave your analysis to you. There's at this stage.
What's the difference between Syria, the situation in Syria and the situation in Ukraine?
There's no U.S. armed forces inside of Syria, and so I don't have a. It's not a parallel situation.
You're
to some of the
sure there's no U.S. military personnel.
I believe there's military activity.
Yeah,
but in terms of a ground presence in Syria, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, 5 U.S. service members were injured in that attack. If there were no U.S. soldier service members in Syria, how could they got injured? That's weird, right? Should I ask
Yeah.
you about that?